So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to, I believe this is our third in our oral history series. I'm joined tonight by Dr. Mark Souther, once again, the director of the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities at Cleveland State University. And he's going to be talking about the Clevelandvoices project. And the title of this talk is actually Clevelandvoices Exploring City and the Region Through Oral History. So he's going to be talking a little bit about all the oral histories that he's had part in this area and talking a little bit more about the Clevelandvoices project as a whole. If you have any questions throughout this discussion, throughout this presentation, please feel free to post them in the chat and we'll have a question and answer section at the end as well. And if you're watching this as a recording, please feel free to post them in the comments as well or email education@shakerhistory.org and we will do our best to answer them. So without further ado, Dr. Mark Souther.
Thanks very much, and thanks to those who are here. I wanted to begin by saying that oral history is something that I've been doing since I was a kid, in a way. I used a cassette recorder to record my grandparents talking about stories of growing up in the North Georgia mountains in the 1920s, and a story about the 1936 tornado in Gainesville, Georgia, that my grandmother survived in the house that I grew up in. So I recorded those back in the 1980s. So that gives you an idea of how long it's been. I was, anywhere from about, I guess about 12 to 17 years old or so when I did those recordings. And I never really did formal oral history work until I came to Cleveland State University a little less than 2 decades ago. So I got involved pretty early on with a project called the Euclid Corridor History Project. And I want to share just a little bit about that briefly, because that leads up to understanding where the Clevelandvoices project originated. So Euclid Corridor was, if you know the Helpline on Euclid Avenue, which is the transit, bus rapid transit system that was put in, I guess it was completed in 2009. There was an earmark in the federal budget for that for a public art component. And so an organization, the predecessor of Land Studio, which is called Cleveland Public Art, reached out to the CSU History Department back in 2005 and wanted to know if we would be interested in providing historical research to involve our students in helping inspire the public art component, so that there would be something of the history of the city represented in the public art. And so a colleague of mine, Mark Thibault, and I were really pleased with this idea because we wanted to work with our students. In fact, he had already worked with students on a cultural gardens project that used oral histories before I arrived at CSU. So he and I worked together along with the artists and with our students and some other partners in the community, and started doing oral histories to inform the research the students were doing and other written sources. So that's really how we got into doing oral history in a more methodical way that led to the Clevelandvoices project. So we started this really by thinking about that we were doing more than just informing the public art. We were actually going to be also involving our students in this sort of real life learning laboratory, if you will, just being out in the community, talking to people, getting other people's voices so that this would not be something that they were just going to the archives and pulling together based on written sources alone. So we were truly sharing authority, which is so central to good oral history. We found as we went that oral history was going to add a really rich layer in addition to those other layers to relate the stories about Euclid Avenue and the places along either side of it, and thereby involve a lot of different people's perspectives on the place. So I want to show you. This is a silent clip that I'm just going to play while I say a little bit more about Euclid Corridor. This is the interface, the user interface, just to give you an idea of how this thing worked. So basically, there was a map that you could access on a touch screen at a kiosk, any of 19 kiosks along Euclid Avenue. And in each one of these zones, there were different places, each of which were clickable, leading to specific sites that we had short historical texts or narratives about. And then there were associated media files, including some oral history clips, some photos. And so this was a combination of archival research and pulling in materials from oral history interviews. So let me pause this because that's enough of that. So this was the backdrop really for Clevelandvoices, and the work on this project started in 2005, and then the touchscreens debuted 4 years later when the helpline opened. So the oral history work that supported this, as I said before, it was sort of what we thought of as a learning laboratory out in the community. And we worked with a number of different community partners, either based along Euclid Avenue, or in some cases they transcended Euclid Avenue. They were citywide or region-wide, but had some interest connecting to Euclid. For this, we consulted with the Library of Congress, which has done a lot with the American Folklife Center, and we also worked with NPR StoryCorps, which informed the approach that we took. And so from these consulting entities, we developed our own model of interviewing, in which we used an interviewer, and we also used what we called a facilitator. So a facilitator was basically somewhat like the StoryCorps model, except that the facilitator was not just operating the equipment and allowing, say, a family member to interview another family member. In this case, the facilitator also had done some research into the background of the person being interviewed and into the context of what was being discussed, so that you actually had another set of ears, basically, so that at the end of the interview, the interviewer would turn to the facilitator and ask if that person would like to add any questions of their own. So sometimes it was really nice, since this was a teaching exercise. It was an opportunity for the interviewer to see what they missed, possibly, because sometimes the facilitator would pipe up with a question or two that they were based on things that were said in responses to the interviewer's questions, and maybe the interviewer didn't see the opportunity in the moment to follow up with those additional questions. So the students learned oral history methodology in the classroom before they set out into doing this themselves. Then we had them start by facilitating professor-led interviews. From there, they went to conducting their own interview, often facilitated by one of us, and giving feedback. And then finally, they would go out, in many cases, in pairs. So they would be two students, and they would support each other in that process. Sometimes we also arranged oral history days, where a community organization that we worked with would make contacts and schedule interviews, and those would take place in various locations around the city, like the Gordon Square Arcade over in Detroit Shoreway. So ultimately, we worked with dozens of community partners, ranging from the Cleveland Artists Foundation to University Circle Incorporated, and many, many more. Also, some in Shaker Heights ultimately were involved once the project moved beyond specifically the Euclid corridor. So the idea of Clevelandvoices then emerged because we were doing oral histories that were very much about people reminiscing about experiences in connection to a place or places. And in the process, we were actually realizing, hey, we're developing an archive, like it or not. we need to be good stewards of the full interviews, not just use them for a particular need. And so that really is how Cleveland Voices got started, because we needed to think about being stewards of the material we were collecting, and hopefully to make it publicly available for uses other than our own. So we amassed first dozens of interviews, and then we topped 100, and then we were on to 200, 300, 400. And at that point, we were looking to the CSU library for assistance. And they helped us by accessioning all of the interviews into a new institutional repository database that they were setting up more broadly. So for the first time, then all of our several hundred interviews were now publicly accessible. Then about 5 years ago, we developed the Clevelandvoices.org website, which is just a more user-friendly setting for people to enjoy streaming the interviews. They still connect back to the official repository where these are stored in the cloud, but it basically harvests the data, the digital files, just to stream them and serve them to the public. So if you go to clevelandvoices.org, you'll find about 1,160 something interviews at last count. And we're periodically adding more, including this summer, we're going to be adding some more as part of the Shaker Historical Society's oral history program. Thanks to Ohio Humanities, which is funding this. I see someone is joining, so I'm going to admit them since I'm a co-host. So continuing on, Cleveland Historical then is another project that used these interviews and grew out of the oral histories and the Euclid Corridor project. So in 2007, the iPhone debuted, and it's right in the middle of this time when we were actually looking at these touchscreen kiosks, which are fixed in place. You have to use them on at a transit stop. And so this was an opportunity to rethink, where and how people would access this type of curated content about the city's history. And also an opportunity not just to put it in their hand, ultimately, in the form of a mobile app, but to rethink the geography that we were able to curate. So instead of curating a corridor, one corridor out of many in a metropolitan area, we were able to think about curating anywhere, really, that you could imagine, hundreds of places or more. And so that's what we went on to do over the ensuing 10 or 11 years up till the present. So a lot of the material here, like in Euclid Corridor before it, draws quite a lot on oral histories, though not exclusively. So I thought what I would do, since this is a Shaker Historical Society program, is to pull some oral history content for you to get a feel for what this collection has, by looking just specifically at some Shaker Heights. And since I live in Cleveland Heights, I threw in some Cleveland Heights material as well. So I hope you'll enjoy these examples. Go to our first one. The first one, there's a series of a few that I'm going to play by Clara Rankin, who grew up on Fairmount Boulevard in the 1920s and 1930s. So this is in Cleveland Heights. The first clip I'm going to play is what I would call a handed down memory rather than her own. But I think it gives a feel for how the memory of the North Union Shakers that gave Shaker Heights its name continued to animate a sense of place in Shaker Heights long after the community had passed on.
We always knew about the Shakers because Mother said that her father had brought her out when she was a little girl, and it must have been shortly before they closed. Her father was a seedsman, and so he would come out, and get get what his supplies had to be from them, and he took her out there. So she remembered actually going to the Shaker community, and she took a great interest in the Russell stone for the man named Russell who was buried under a tree at South Park and Lee. And she also interested herself in the development of the Shaker Historical Society a little bit.
Okay, so this was an example, as I said, of a handed down memory, but does show that the sense of place that people in Shaker Heights have. In some cases, there are people who we interviewed just several years ago who were alive to remember the stories their parents told about actually seeing the Shakers. I have another one along these lines in which she describes a line of trees behind her family's property that came out of the Shaker period itself.
Mother used to talk about a lane that had to do with the Shaker settlement, which showed a line of trees. There was no longer a lane, but the line of trees was in the back of our property and was visible as having once been a lane. And it was on a diagonal, so it didn't bear any resemblance to the grid of Fairmount, North Park, South Park, and the rest of those east-west streets. But I do remember that, and there was nothing ever developed about the idea. It was just something she knew. But there were wonderful trees on the property at the back, and my parents took a lot of interest in, and perhaps even you could say a little pride in, their garden.
And one more well, I have two more. One more next in which she talks about the Shaker Lakes in the 1930s. And this gives a feel for some of the visual markers of places that stood out to her from her own childhood experiences.
Well, we had bicycles. And so we rode our bicycles a lot. And we had a lot of trails that took us Lee Road to South Park, down South Park and around and up by North Park and back on North Park and around. And, there were the GGG Peckhams. Do you know that house that's on South Park at where South Park goes to Shaker? It's a great big red brick house. And that amused us because the sign in the front said GGG Peckham. We like to say that out loud. And the woods was between the North and South Park, the way it is today, part of the park system. And it was a mysterious place. But if you got yourself down to where North Park met that little cross Fairmount that took you to South Park, that was where we coasted in the winter. There was a hill that, of course, is very mild looking now, but it was a great sledding hill for us long before there was any building.
And one last one from Ms. Reinken, in which she talks about how different things were in the 1930s in a couple of sentences.
Well, we had bicycles.
Oh,
and so we
sorry.
rode our bicycles a lot.
I must have got the wrong. Let me try this one more time.
Well, we had.
I'm sorry, I must have put the wrong one in here. In this one anyway, I'll just mention it's a really interesting one because she talks about Italian women coming to the door and knocking on the door there on Fairmount Boulevard and asking her father if they could pick the dandelions. And she was speculating as to what reason they had for picking those. Did they want them for the greens? Did they possibly use them in some sort of wine? So she was speculating on the various uses, but saying that her father was always delighted because these were things that they were weeds to him, but to the women who came, they had a purpose other than as weeds. So I just found that a really interesting thing. And she also talked about the Iceman coming. And of course, the Iceman doesn't come anymore. Today, we use a refrigerator to keep things cold. And if we have dandelions in our yard, as many of us do, they either stay there or maybe we hire a lawn service to take care of them or use some sort of something that we buy from a garden center. So it does really show you in some ways how differently people often lived. Moving on to a different example, certain examples from the collection. There are myriad examples of this, but I've chosen just a couple that illustrate how place is intensely personal for people. This is Kathleen Crowther of the Cleveland Restoration Society talking about how Shaker Square for her family was more than a place. It was really an essential feature in her family's Christmas tradition.
I mean, Shaker Square was a destination, a place to go, and there were unique places there. There was Clark's Restaurant, and we would go there. We knew it was a special thing to go to Clark's Restaurant on a Sunday, usually, if our family would go out to dinner, mom, dad, and the kids. That was a special thing. And also the Christmas lights is my strongest memory of Shaker Square, because they would always deck the square out in great Christmas lights. We had a family tradition of my dad would take us in the car down to see the Christmas lights, and when we returned home, by then Santa Claus would have come, and all of our gifts would be under the tree, so we were allowed to open the gifts then. It was Christmas Eve.
And one more in this vein, this is from Robert O'Neill from Shaker Heights. He talks about a visit that Mr. Jingling made to his house in 1958 when he was 4 years old. And, when I listen to this one, I think about how sometimes these intensively personal memories challenge our prevailing views about either people, places, or events.
Well, one of the interesting things in my life, I don't know if you know about a Mr. Jingling, but this was a guy that was on local TV, and he had a drawing every year where he'd pick one family and he'd give them $500. He picked me when I was real young, and he came to my house, and I was about 4 years old, and when he came, he was in full makeup, and he scared me to death.
So, as I said, this is an example certainly of how some of the things that we may think we know, Mr. Jingling, for example, I think most people think, oh, this is this character, of course, from the Halley's department store, a much beloved character. You can still get tree ornaments from Hickson's florist of Mr. Jingling from years ago. But to this particular child, this was a frightening experience because he seemed very strange in all of his makeup and his costume. So he scared this particular child. Not the typical story, I guess, that you get of this. Moving from this example, let me go to the next one. Oral histories also really offer an opportunity to think about tougher issues. In this case, racism and how we respond to that. Ludlow, and many in our audience know Ludlow because it straddles the line between Shaker Heights and the city of Cleveland. For anyone who is not familiar with Ludlow, in the mid-1950s, this was really a national model that became widely reported on because of the way that this community decided that it was going to come together to fight disinvestment, fight racial steering, to make this a community that would be deliberately integrated. The way they went about doing that was controversial because they had to overcome real estate practices, basically in which realtors quit showing homes to white buyers and decided that this area was going to become African American. The community, to counter that, tried to actively seek out white buyers who were interested in living in an integrated community, and they ultimately set up this organization basically that was a source of basically countering what the realtors were doing. So it's actively courting these buyers who otherwise would not have been shown these homes. But for many African Americans looking at Ludlow, when there were very few places in the suburbs that would accept African American buyers, this looked like a door being slammed in their face to actually actively seek out white buyers. So it was controversial, but this is a sort of maybe a different take on the experience of being African American, and what it was like to move into this neighborhood. So I'm going to play this clip from Fran King.
When we were purchasing our house, the Van Swearingen covenants were still in effect, and the real estate person that we were dealing with said, "You'll have to go around to the neighborhood and get written consent of the people who live on your block. You have to get like 3 or 5." And so I remember a cold February day when I was out ringing doorbells, and I was surprised because I didn't encounter what I thought, the people I needed consent from signed. And then when we actually moved into the house a couple of months later, I find that those people had gone. So they were interested in selling their properties too. So why object to mine? And I was a little cynical about that.
So in this case, white flight, of course. So she had the illusion of acceptance, only to find that appearance was fleeting when she moved into the home. Oral histories also remind us how intensively personal connections to place can lead us to defend the places that matter when they face destruction. And the next example
we
is
were purchasing our house.
Let me go back there. This particular example is one drawn from the collection, but it's one of the many documentaries that appear on MINI many. It's many also, but they're short documentaries that pull together one or more oral history clips with still images that are put together in the fashion of a sort of like a Ken Burns style documentary. So this one I think will be familiar to many.
We had a county engineer by the name of Albert Porter. He controlled transportation in Cuyahoga County. Let's get him straight. He was a county engineer, but he was also head of the Democratic Party, which made him a very powerful guy. He was a highwayman. He was a concrete man. He didn't want to hear of anything else, and he ruled.
Albert Porter, he had an interview which appeared on the front page of the Plain Dealer, in which he said he didn't see why people were so upset about this rinky-dinky duck pond. Well, that was wonderful because rinky-dinky duck pond became our slogan. So in a sense, to have an easily identifiable enemy was a great boon to our efforts.
You ask, how did we work people up? How did people come in? Can you imagine telling people in Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights that all they have over there is a rinky-dinky duck pond?
So that's one of the examples from Cleveland Historical. This one is on a story titled "The Shaker Lakes Freeway Fight." So you can find that on Cleveland Historical if you'd like to learn more. Sometimes oral histories also offer the only evidence that we have of past experiences. One of these, the one I'm about to play, so intrigued me that I went on to research the circumstances surrounding it. The interview was done about 20 years ago. This was actually one that we accessioned basically into the collection to use with Cleveland Historical. But it was done by the city of Cleveland Heights back in, I think, 2002. So this is an interview with a Cleveland Heights man named Stanley Adelstein, who lived in my neighborhood where I live now, about 5 blocks from our house. And he revealed how an African-American family had moved there in the early 1930s and had stayed for many, many years. So let's listen to his account of that arrival and the reaction of the neighbors.
The corner house at Washington Boulevard and Cottage Grove on the northeast corner was purchased when I was about maybe 14 or 15 years old, which would be about 1932 or 33, by a black family. And in those days, that was considered a very negative thing. And I think I regret very much that the people who have been living on Washington Boulevard were so upset at the thought of a black family becoming a neighbor of theirs that when they learned of the fact, the neighbors put together enough money and they got somebody to plant a explosive. And it was a bombing that occurred at the corner of Washington Boulevard and Cottage Grove, a northeast corner. As a child, I remember after the bombing occurred, everybody rushed out in the street, and the black family consisted of a physician and his wife, and the wife kept saying to the police, "I don't know why this happened. I never will understand why this happened." But the good people who lived on Washington Boulevard, probably my family included, had all felt so badly their property values would decrease because of a black family moving in, that they had pitched in to try to keep them from moving in. They moved in, of course. They lived there for many, many years, and they were a very fine addition to the neighborhood.
So I've ended up researching this, and there was no written account of this bombing, but there are accounts of the family and their experience in the neighborhood in the 30 years that followed. They were also listed when the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, did the real estate appraisal maps for the federal government in the 1930s and up to 1940 that we now call the infamous redlining maps. There was a mention made of this one family in the appraisal for that particular block. And it's interesting because they gave it a blue or B rating, which is the second highest rating that you could give a neighborhood. And the only negative thing that they had to say was, I believe, I'll be quoting them when I say this, I think it says one colored family at the corner of Washington and Cottage Grove. So this was an asterisk that appeared under a line about race. And basically it said that there were no African Americans, but it had an asterisk by that to indicate that there was one, and here was the corner where they lived. So it showed what a sort of a big deal it was at that time. In 1968, I'm going to play 4 clips to close here from Isaac Hagans. This is an interview that I did in 2013. In November '68, Isaac Hagans became the first African-American real estate broker to open a suburban office in any Cleveland suburb. This was on North Taylor Road in the northern part of Cleveland Heights. And in my interview with him, I learned that Hagans was born in 1930 in New Bern, North Carolina. He moved several years later to Asbury Park, New Jersey, where his father waited tables in the hotels. After college, he went to West Virginia State College, and then shortly after that, he followed his brother up to Cleveland and lived with him for a time in Glenville in an apartment before buying his own home in 1956 near Rockefeller Park. After a short stint of selling shoes, Hagans got into real estate. His grandfather had also been born in North Carolina, and in the late 19th century had become a real estate developer of homes for Blacks in New Bern. And he went on to serve in the North Carolina legislature before the onslaught of white supremacy that disenfranchised Black voters by 1900. But Hagans' inspiration for challenging racial barriers in housing in Cleveland actually also drew from a more immediate context later, as you'll hear in this first clip.
The thing that I did that I wanted so badly to have done was to see, because I had met with Carl Stokes, he was the first black mayor of Cleveland, and Dr. King. He had a party, and I was invited to it, and I did personally talk with him, and he gave me his idea of his dream and his idea, and I felt as a black person, a realtor, that I couldn't just sit back and just sell black, but I was equally a licensed party. And if I was in an area which this time was more of an integrated area here, to sell white as well, and that was the idea.
And he went on to talk about the Forest Hill restrictions. He came to find out how he was right across the street from the Forest Hill section in the northern part of Cleveland Heights and southern part of East Cleveland. And this particular neighborhood did not have restrictive covenants per se that forbade selling to African Americans or to any other particular group. But what it did have was a board, basically a homeowners association board that sort of either approved or rejected all sales. Everything came before them. And so in its own way, it's sort of like a variation on the same theme of what the Van Swearingen restrictions did in a different manner in Shaker Heights in the same years. So he talks here about these unwritten racial restrictions and how they impacted him, and also someone that he was representing as a real estate agent.
The restriction was very strong across the street, which I didn't know, and that was Forest Hills. And they thought would have been that I being black, that I would bring some black people in Forest Hills, which would have been a no at that time, that years then. Now, of course, it's much different today, but you're not going to bring. I mean, that was an unwritten law that I later found out that, and that was the reason that say they just a thought. I mean, it was that area was rough. I mean, that's because there were cases where this one man, he was a doctor. He listed his house with me because a lot of people gave me a listing because they wanted to feel that it should be an open market for everybody. And they spit on his kids, fighting his kids. I mean, it was terrible. And he finally told me, he said, well, I wanted to do it, but I got to, because I'm being threatened. He was worked at a Human Rose Hospital. I mean, it was also, it wasn't just me. They would go after whoever.
And then he goes on to relate the experience that really led me to interview him in the first place, because 3 months after he opened his realty office on North Taylor, it was bombed. And so oral history, I think, can also bring out some of the details. I mean, this was reported in the newspapers, but you get facts, things that go beyond the facts themselves. You get details and, really sort of a more personalized account of what happened. And in this particular clip, we learned about how really sort of this unforeseen series of events may well have saved his life in the process of this bombing.
I came out, I remember it was about 11 o'clock at night, and they had a sign on the building. I mean, the building was easy. I saw it was all demolished. That what had happened. And that was the case. It was bombed the time that I came to saw it. It was about 11 o'clock that night. And that was the event from taking him in to the house, taking him into the Cleveland Clinic, and decide that his appendix must come out. So, in other words, if they bust, we all know what the problem would have been. If they bust him, he'd have been possibly dead. And if I'm standing in the office, as I would have been, either I would have been either dead or my body would be looking like Chinese checkers, because the bomb was the kind of bomb they had was just cut up everything. So it just slice you. I mean, it was. I mean, you could see the way the furniture was all sliced up.
So the idea of the furniture being all sliced up, and also this turn of events that his son had appendicitis, and had he not had appendicitis and been taken to the Cleveland Clinic, would Mr. Hagans have been in his office as he normally was at that hour, possibly to be blown, blown up by this attacker's bomb? So those are the things that you don't get necessarily in the newspaper account, but that the oral history interview can elicit. And the last one before I sum up is one last one from Mr. Hagans.
I got a tremendous support from everybody, and I got a lot of listings of people and that's where I got. In other words, I wouldn't have got these listings. I got them, and because they would have gone to people in the neighborhood, and yeah, it was right after the bombing. So I just went to work and start serving the people, and they told me the reason. They wanted to say, "Look, I'm fair-minded, and I think what happened to you should not have happened, and we want to go ahead and see if we can." In their own way, they would think they could rectify it by, they have a property they wanted to sell. So I was the broker.
I'm going to stop my share. I'll wait a second to do that. I just wanted to close by saying really what an enriching experience it's been as a professional historian. We don't always get the opportunity, or maybe take the opportunity to do oral history, and it adds such an important dimension. I think we're actually contributing to the historical record when we interview someone, and the thing that I think is also powerful about it is that really anyone can do this. It doesn't have to be the college history professor. It can be anyone. Anyone can learn the techniques of good oral history methodology and employ them and get really good results. So that really it's been a remarkable experience to have been involved with this over the last 15 years or so. And the Clevelandvoices project that grew out of this work that I've had the pleasure of being involved with is a community treasure. I truly believe it's a community treasure. There's always something new to discover. I discover things on a regular basis by going, looking for one thing, and I'll listen to something, and then I'll hear something entirely different that I've never caught before. That's what happens when you have over 1,100 hours of recordings. You can't remember what all is in those. And I truly have not heard 100% of them, even after 15 years. So I also invite you to explore the collection on your own time. And I think that you'll find that there's a lot of wonderful material, and it will reshape how you think about the city and the region and their history. So I'm going to stop the share.